Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming along. My name is Stephen Cherry, and I'm currently the chair of the Hulsean electors. It's a great honour to be able to stand before you and welcome you to the first of 4 Hulsean lectures this academic year. These lectures were established in the late 18th century, and while the original brief was so exacting that no series of lectures took place for several years, and in many years there have been no lectures at all, this remarkable institution has allowed many of the world's most distinguished theologians to give voice to their thoughts and to share their scholarship. Where in many cases, the lectures being a significant, if not transformational moment in the journey from provisional thoughts to the publication of a significant book. This year, the Hulsean lecturer is Dr. Willie Jennings from Yale University, where he is Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Systematic Theology and Africana Studies. His book, Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race, won the 2010 American Academy of Religion Book of the Year in the Constructive Reflective Studies category. His series, Theological Education Between the Times, won the 2020 Book of the Year award from Publishers Weekly. After Whiteness and Education in Belonging being the first book in that series. Willie is an ordained Baptist minister as well as a prolific and profound theologian. His undergraduate study was at Calvin College, grew up in the same town, Grand Rapids. His MDiv was from Fuller Theological Seminary, and his PhD was in religion and ethics at Duke University. The success, interest, and profundity of Willie's publications have led to many requests to travel and to speak, and it is to our great benefit that he's agreed to give the Hulsean lectures this year. The lecture, by the way, will be recorded. There will be the Q&A that follows won't be recorded. His theme is unfolding creation. And as he takes us through his thinking, he will encourage us to reflect profoundly on themes such as relationality, connectivity, stewardship, and responsibility to fashion a just and sustainable common life. When we've concluded our time in here, everyone is invited to continue the conversation with a glass in their hand in the lobby. I have no further words of introduction except to celebrate the fact that when, in a moment, he comes to speak to us, it will be the very first occasion on which the Hulsean lectures have been given by an Afro-American. Willie, welcome.
Good evening. I want to thank Dr. Ferguson, Dean Cherry, and the Hulsean lectors for allowing me the singular honor of giving these esteemed lectures. I also, if I may, just take a moment to thank the faculty and staff of Westminster College, where I am staying, for the warmth and the hospitality of hosting me here in Cambridge. This is my first time to Cambridge, and I'm so glad to be here. Last year I was at Oxford, and as Dean Cherry said, the goal is to make sure that I have a better time at Cambridge than I had at Oxford. So I'm looking forward to that. My friends, let me begin by bringing you greatest and warmest greetings from Dean Gregory Sterling, the faculty, the staff, and the students of Yale Divinity School, where I have the joy of serving. Yale University and my home in Hamden, Connecticut, resides on the unceded land of Algonquin-speaking people who have shepherded those lands for thousands of years. And it is my responsibility as a Christian, as a theologian, as someone who pays attention to where I am, to honor their shepherding of the land and to be a part of doing what I can to show that I carry forward that desire to shepherd the land. But more importantly, to be a part of every effort to give the land back. I also want to dedicate these lectures to my two eldest brothers, Ivory James Jr. and James Jennings Sr. Less than a month ago, over the span of just 2 weeks, both my brothers died. One due to complications from cancer, the other due to complications from kidney disease. They were deeply committed Christians, both born in the hateful Jim Crow South in the United States, the hateful South, long before the civil rights movement in the US. They experienced the full power of white supremacy, but they never let the hatred that surrounded them, that attacked them, enter them. They were relentlessly gracious, kind, loving, and brilliant men who carried the designation disciples of Jesus until they died. They were my North Star. They were my compass that pointed the way to live. I bear witness to them through these lectures. Before I begin, I also want to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Jones, who is here. It is so good to see you, Dr. Jones. Always glad to be in your presence, and your wonderful, wonderful husband, Calvin. My friends, I have been in pursuit of what most Christians and Christian communities don't have. And that is a real doctrine of creation. Now, it might seem counterintuitive and downright wrong to suggest such a thing, given the clear presence of doctrines of creation throughout the history of doctrinal formulation and the current plethora of such articulations today. It is, however, my contention that the presence of doctrines of creation does not mean that we have the pedagogy necessary to teach us what it means to be creatures or to form our quotidian practices in ways that touch the density of creaturely life formed for communion with the triune God. In fact, our doctrines of creation, as they currently exist, impede such a pedagogy. We need what I call a pedagogy of the unfolding of creation. The unfolding of creation. This is the term I want to use to shape these lectures and to suggest a reformulation of the doctrine. Through these 4 lectures, I will outline what I consider to be some of the essential matters in such a reformulation, matters inherent to the unfolding. To aid me in this effort of reformulation, I will from time to time turn to the wisdom of poets, drawing on their words and offering some of my own poetic verse. What do you think? It's often the case that we need the poetic to discern the deep connection between bone and dirt. Bone and dirt are, for me, shorthand for articulating the interweaving of body and land, thought and building, designing and dreaming. All are necessary for the reformulation. By reformulation, my friends, I am not advocating a completely new Christian doctrine of creation. I am suggesting a renovation that would mean taking the doctrine like a house down to its stubs and repositioning the wood framing, changing the structural outline, and thereby recalibrating the trajectory of dream and vision for what the house will be, who the house will hold, and ultimately, who we hope will make it a home. In this first lecture, I want to weave together prolegomena and positionality, prolegomena and positionality, and rethink together with you from where emerges the way we perceive the world as creation and ourselves as creatures. In this regard, I want to make the first question of a doctrine of creation the question that has rarely, if ever, been asked. But it is indeed, my friends, it is indeed the first question that should have been asked to situate our perceiving of the world as creation. What is that question? What do you do? What do you do when you find out that the God that created you and indeed loves you is in fact not the gods of your people, but the gods of another people who may not like you? Inside this question is another question even more poignant and pressing. What does it mean? What does it mean to enter the way another people see the creation? These questions allow us to step on the terrain where emerges, let's call it creaturely perception, and where a doctrine of creation should form from being positioned with other people, joined together and seeing ourselves as creatures of the living God. Yet the joining of positionality and prolegomena requires we take up a matter from the start that Christian theology has avoided addressing, especially since the emergence of colonial modernity, colonialism from the 15th century forward. That is the problem of assimilation. The problem of assimilation. To begin answering these questions I mentioned a moment ago, we must begin with an absence, an absence. I want to mourn an absence that cannot be easily mourned. Mourning requires knowledge of an absence, and very few people know or sense this law. Absence and presence are, as you all know here, complex ideas in the history of Christian thought that bring with them the demand for subtlety in articulation. So by absence, we don't only mean that something was missing. We also mean that something was present but not perceived. Then when glimpses of it flashed into brief recognition, was resisted and refused, pressed to the very edge of existence. What is the absent thing? It will take time to explain this absence because it involves grasping what is missing precisely at the place where something was forming, at the site where Christianity was forming. There at the place of an unprecedented interface between Jews and Gentiles, a new mode of relating to the living world was poised to form. There, even before the difference between Jew and Christian formed, even before Christians would know themselves as people called Christian, there at that place, a possibility emerged and then began to fade before it could be fully grasped. The absence emerged slowly and painfully after the fading, and I can only attend to this absence through a work of tracing, this idea from Mark Jordan, a work of tracing. I will attempt to gather from the fragment, textual and narrative, the traces of what appeared and then disappeared, leaving evidence of its existence, or more precisely, its attempt to come into existence. Attending to this absence, I will trace a single scene in this lecture, the second scene in the next lecture. Scenes in this sense are textual sites, S-I-T-E-S, sites that illumine the emerging absence as it was in the process of spreading, like a change in seasons across a wide terrain of thinking, perceiving, and feeling. I am, through tracing these scenes, aiming to show a gift left at the door of a Christianity forming with this absence, a gift yet to be touched and fully incorporated into the life strategies of Christians. I will first trace what I term a scene of revision, where the doctrine of creation was poised to form. The first scene registers the possibility of a different subjectivity emerging in the tense, generative space between Jew and Gentile. This scene allows us to see the absence growing, and from where we can begin to see the loss that was never grasped as a loss. The scene of revision is found in Acts 10 and a little bit of 11. Woven together through several meetings that are familiar to us all, but also frontier. In the beginning, there was Jew and Gentile, a beginning that would make possible a beginning. Long before those who would call themselves Christian found their way to the Torah, those opening chapters of a book called Genesis, they knew this difference. It was a difference not discoverable from the plateau of the universal, but only through the real histories of struggle, tension, war, negotiation, exchange. Jew-Gentile difference was made visible through sometimes parallel and sometimes collaborative practices of living life on land with animals through hunting, planting, harvesting, buying, selling, as well as through the rise and fall of regimes, some benign, some malignant. Jew-Gentile difference emerged at the site of practices, agricultural, environmental, social, bodily, culinary, indicated a constant involvement with a particular deity, the God of Israel. The involvement formed an inside and an outside, not for God, but for these people called Judeans. Inside and outside are both ancient and modern designations. I am concerned at this moment with its ancient modality that allowed for the articulation of a particular kind of entrance. There is a door at this beginning, door of perception, or more precisely, perception of a door. Walking through that door meant entering the fleshly borders of Israel's common life. Once inside, one would encounter another difference that reached deeply into the beginning, the difference between the creator and the creature. That difference was a currency that moved through biblical Israel's every ritual and practice, every prayer and song, every bite of food and drink of water. The scene from chapter 10, 11 in the book of Acts is a kind of creation before the creation, and the familiar lays heavily across it. There was that centurion named Cornelius, there a disciple of Jesus, whose name is well known to us. It is Peter. Each of them marked by meeting God, each of them marked by a profound difference in positionality. Cornelius is a central agent of the Roman social order, who was also a God-fearer, one familiar with the God of Israel, yet he is Gentile, uncircumcised, one not of Israel. Cornelius waits for the arrival of Peter, who he has called upon at the command of a messenger, angel from God. Yet Peter waits. He waits in prayer and hunger. Someone prepares food for him. And as he waits, God enters the scene amid Peter's praying and hungering. It is crucial for our purposes because understanding what will follow depends on remembering this praying and hungering. God lowers that sheet filled with food for the future. Peter, this follower of Jesus, now learns of the desire of God. Through vision, God invites Peter into, let's call it a reordered reality of predation. Reordered reality of predation toward eating what he would not as a faithful Jew. 10:9-16. Peter knew what ancient peoples knew, what God articulated through the grammar of animality, by which I mean a way of signifying that understands that animals implicate specific lands with specific peoples. The land, the animals, and the people. The land, the animals, and the people are always woven together. To name one is to imply the others, and to imply different rituals and practices of predation, of hunting, killing, preparing, cooking, and eating. Eating different animals, all of which invite different configurations of life. How else do you prepare an animal without a life? Precisely because it implies different eating with other people. Christian theology has tended to run too fast past this vision to get to a point of universal application. God is showing Peter, and by implication all of Israel, that Gentiles are now included by divine desire in the salvation offered to Israel through Jesus of Nazareth. There has always been a terrible impatience in the history of theological interpretation in relation to this story. That intellectual impatience has locked centuries of readers in a metaphor. The animals on the sheet in this part of the scene stand in for people, Gentile people. We see, according to this metaphor prison house, a 1-to-1 ratio, animals to people, animals in the vision and people in reality. Yet in Peter's world, animals are with people. And in this moment, in the story, the animals do not disappear into the theological background any more than Peter's real hunger disappears. They are there, animals, hunger, Peter, Cornelius, and his slaves, and the soldiers under his command. They're there together. Now, saying that they are together does not deny that this is a vision and not an actual sheet with animals, nor am I denying the distinctions or differences between humans and other animals. It means that reconfigurations within a web of life are implied by the vision with its lowering of the sheet, and not simply the consumption of metaphorical meat. More to the point, the lowering of the sheet implies more than the acceptance of Gentile bodies, but also the acceptance of their ways of living on land and sea with plants and animals. The story moves on. The story moves to an unprecedented joining of Jew and Gentile through water and spirit and eating. Unfortunately, has been allowed only limited range in the imagination of Christian. Its interpretation collapsed into a single trajectory. The gospel of Jesus is now available to everyone. This, of course, is true. But this interpretive trajectory reveals theological entropy. Something shrunk, lost circulation, and thus closed off a path of perception. That path of perception begun in this scene involved a connection between Jew and Gentile that was meant to be both personal and pedagogical. From the emergence of this tense, generative space between Jew and Gentile could come the slow awareness of a shared claiming by a loving creator God with the realization that together they must now enter a shared project of revision that would be an ongoing reconfiguration of perception and experience. The scene presents the possibility of a new trajectory of thought and life, through which the stories we Gentiles have told ourselves and of our gods come into review. We Gentiles have become what I have called second readers now. We are created by Israel's God, and now we read after Israel from inside their story and with them, following their own reading of the world. Being a second reader offers both a spatial and temporal perceptual possibility for Gentiles of entering a new way of understanding life as the creation of Israel's God. All of this is a surprise, disrupting, dismantling, maybe even destroying the connection between we Gentiles, multiple as we are, and our many gods. Of course, it should always be said that not every god was tyrannical, but all gods are now seen in the light cast by the resurrected Jesus of Nazareth and the coming of the Holy Spirit. Biblical Israel, for its part, is also brought by God into a second reading inside their reading, to follow the Spirit into the wideness of their God, as John Wesley would say, the wideness of their God and the fullness of this God's creation. Second reading for biblical Israel would constitute a different kind of new than for Gentiles. It was the expansion of sight, not the abandonment of it. But before we mark this as a possible intellectual precursor to proselytism or evangelism, it is first Jewish followers of Jesus grasping the ways of their God in and on Gentile flesh, in and through Gentile ways of life, and the task of conceiving and helping Gentiles to enact faithfulness to the God of Israel beyond the Jewish body. This is a new interface, Jew and Gentile enabled by the Spirit. Of course, none of this would be seamless or easy or easily accepted. This is rough terrain. No roadmap here, only steps in and toward revision and reconfiguration. This scene welcomes the unprecedented and thereby forms the ground for an abiding, even relentless improvisation that would call Jew and Gentile to move in and out of the intertextual and the intercultural, weaving together Jewish diaspora reading practices of text and world with Gentile cultural practices and Gentile reading practices of text and world, Jewish diaspora cultural practices. Much could be said about this moment, but I want to trace out the invitation as implied by this theme, whereby Jew and Gentile are invited into a shared sensing and articulating of the divine claim and our creaturely connection to one another. Together, Jew and Gentile will consider freshly what I call They're protocols of earth touch. Protocols of earth touch. The protocols of earth touch mean the ways we touch land, plant, water, sky, animal, and with what forms of intentionality and reciprocity, with care or fear, hope or desire, how we have been guided in that touch by our gods and our ancestors. The protocols of earth touch for Jews and Gentiles have been intercepted by the touch of our Creator through the Spirit at the site of Israel's life. Because of this, let's call it this pneumatological disruption, they have come to the door of a complex new task of relating to the living world. Jew and Gentile were poised to step forward together in learning of the intricacies of the divine intimacy with the creation. Acts 10:15, God is made clean, you must not call profane. This learning of the intricacies of divine intimacy with the creation would constitute a new path of contemplation on the frontiers of difference. A new path of contemplation on the frontiers of difference. This would be for the sake of a new life together in the Spirit and with the earth. Something breaks open in this scene that is essential for a new way of living that the Spirit of God will now invite Jew and Gentile to enter together. They spoke, if you recall, they spoke other languages by the power of the Spirit, and now they are being drawn into the life of Jesus together while being drawn to the lives of other peoples. They are being turned out together for the lands and peoples of the world to enter those worlds, becoming one with them, and ultimately allowing those worlds to speak through them for the sake of the glory of God. This means that the Jew-Gentile interface of Acts 10 implies the unfolding of that relation, toward a new orientation. It will be an orientation of contemplation toward a new practice of assimilation. To assimilate in this regard means first to follow in the way of another, to speak and to eat. I keep saying that. To speak and to eat after another in order to construct a shared form of existing. In this sense, I want to hold assimilation close to the logic of confession. To speak the same, homologeo, to speak the same, and to eat the same. Indeed, I would suggest this form of assimilation is inherent in confession. It's inherent in confession. This would be a practice of assimilation without destruction. More precisely, a practice of being assimilated without being destroyed. Now, to follow my argument here, two things are necessary. First, we have to step away from the obsessive focus of centuries of interpretation on the status of Jewish identity through this new relation with Gentiles in this story, and especially this scene. That focus, my friends, is understandable given the history of Jewish erasure that builds, in some cases, directly from interpretations of Acts 10 and 11. The crucial matter I want to draw from this scene is not the status of Jewish identity in the relating of Jews and Gentiles, but the orienting work the Spirit of God is doing with both Jew and Gentile. Secondly, we must remember that Gentile does not refer to a single people, a monolith of identity, but Gentile is a situation, similar to how the philosopher Toriel Moy, following Simone Bouvier, designates gender as a situation. Gentile is a frontier of relation. Thus, the shared task of those Jews and Gentiles who found themselves yielding to his spirit would be to sense and articulate God's claim upon them together, a shared being claim. A shared being claim. How does one announce a new reality of being claimed together with other peoples amid ways of life that are already structured in claim, claimed by God and ritual, customs, and practice? What would it mean to form a new constellation of practices that would reorganize those structures, turn them toward life in and with the Spirit of God? Those new practices, in effect, would outline a practice of assimilation. It is precisely with the building out of a practice of assimilation that I want to situate our approach to a doctrine of creation, and especially the activities of contemplation and reflection, seeking to grasp the new, to understand the different ways of people in and with the earth, with animals, plants, seasons, landscapes, and thereby to begin a work of creating, or more precisely, co-creating, if you will, new ways of living in and perceiving the creation. A poem for you, one of my own, entitled Strange Mission, Strange Mission. What did the missionary see? This rare one, who felt divine gaze coming from the strange, sensed the hand of God with many fingers, pulling everything off their body, their clothing, their skin, their senses being replaced with new knowing, their language born anew, born from the ground above. And now one with land and sea, second child of the seal and of the deer, they witness Jesus of the deep forest, proclaim the dirt-bound God. They will go missing. Too much future for the present believing. Their records destroyed, their testimony denied, their name crossed out of the official remembering, called home, or left there for dead, even while living. Prophet no more. Priest of the unfinished. But what did they see? My poem speaks to a way of touching and knowing creation, found through being recreated. It speaks to those missionaries that we have very scant records of, who in the old phrase went native, became one with the peoples they were sent to convert, and thereby became unidentifiable to their churches, to their mission board. What if such recreation was prerequisite to perceiving creation? Here I want to borrow from Catherine Keller and her notion of a creatio ex profundis, a creation out of the depths, even a creation out of the chaotic depths. I will not follow Keller in her assault on the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo. Keller famously improvises in the space between Genesis 1 and 1 and 1 and 2, bringing her considerable theological creativity to the phrase, the face of the deep, the watery chaos, as she calls it. As she says, a complex reality that is not the creator and is not the creation, that can only be spoken of poetically. For Keller, to reflect on that complex reality necessitates a biblical counter-doctrine of creation out of the chaotic depth. This doctrine counters the interpretive strategies that frame God as an omnipotent overlord who creates out of nothing and thereby creates an inescapable hierarchy. Like so many others, I find Keller's critique, though creative and sophisticated, unconvincing, because it continues the habit of mind of processed thought, of conceptualizing God's power before God's identity. In this regard, it remains, as I will consider in the next lecture, a painful exercise in both supersessionist and racial thinking. If, however, we reposition creatio ex profundis to the site where the task of forming subjectivities that announce a shared being claim and thereby build out a practice of assimilation, then we have aligned our work of discerning with the depths that really matter. The depths of different people's ways of being in the world, their ways of being with animals and plants, land and sea, the elements and the seasons, the depths of their stories and rationalities. Here we approach the frontiers of difference, calibrated through the land and through the grammar of animality. We have returned to the sheet of Acts 10 and the moment of disclosure and possibility, even surprise for biblical Israel, where the chaotic depths of other people's ways of living that had been prohibited for them are now sites, S-I-T-E-S, sites where they must enter new creating, co-creating with them a life in the spirit of the disciples of Jesus. Here to name the chaotic is not a pejorative speech act, but to invoke the sometimes frightening, sometimes disorienting work of weaving life, story, practice, and belief. It is the call to improvise. Here at the chaotic depth, we are at the frontier of the ongoing work of defining and redefining faithfulness to the God of Israel for biblical Israel. New states of dwelling with God, new places with living with others, of living with others. The lowering of the sheet is the entering of the depths of creation, out of which something new will emerge. Here we have arrived at the work of grasping the unfolding of creation and of giving witness to a new knowing inside. Beautifully strange contemplation. Of course, this is not what happened. This is the first absent. This is the first aspect of the absent thing. This drama of the unfolding is missing. To say that this drama is missing is not to say that Christians and their theologians forgot about this scene. It is to say that what this scene illumines is missing. That is, a trajectory for a shared project of embodying the divine claim upon us as creatures, through the spirit, all the way to the bone and the dirt. That is what is missing. Because it is missing, something else is absent. A practice of assimilation, cultivated over time, that might have given rise to a different kind of doctrine of creation. One that first would be formed inside the work of connecting multiple and diverse peoples in the actual living of creaturely life. And then secondly, one that creates a pedagogy of sensing and articulating the divine claim that links through multiple peoples to all living things. This doctrine of creation would never leave the sense of second reading, never leave the fundamental reality that we are reading after biblical Israel, and therefore never leave the practice of second reading. But Brother Willie, why assimilation? That's the question that should still be on your mind. Why assimilation? The idea of assimilation both in its ancient instantiation, as well as on this side of colonial modernity, carries the tragic connotations of absorption, loss, and death, and is therefore, for many people, fundamentally irredeemable as a positive idea. We meet this idea most powerfully through the history of Christianity's crucial role in establishing practices of assimilation in the modern world. I need not rehearse the long, dismal history of virulent assimilation born of colonial modernity and Christianity that continues to this very moment. The critical matter for us in that ongoing history of assimilation is what it did and does to the reality of creaturely becoming. We will give ourselves more time to consider the idea of creaturely becoming in our next lecture. But at this point, we are simply naming the temporality that constitutes our existence as creatures and are being subject to various temporal frames that map growth, development, and brutal evaluative logics. Growth, development, and brutal evaluative logics. The practices of assimilation facilitated by colonial Christianity captured both body and land and aimed both at an imagined maturity rooted in the white European and his ways of life. The European colonial settler seized the trajectories of becoming. Trajectories of becoming of peoples and turned those trajectories toward European life. As I've said before, people grow, people mature. Colonial settlers believed this, but they also believed that it was their responsibility and their right to define what growth and maturity looked like for everyone. And in so believing, subverted the reality of creaturely becoming. Let me be clear. Christianity did not invent assimilation. Assimilation practices reach into the ways ancient conquerors stole lands and enslaved peoples. Yet with colonial practices of assimilation, we meet Europeans who imagine that they were articulating and enacting universals. Freedom, rationality, autonomy, sovereignty, all aimed at flourishing life, both in the colonies and the metropole. In this regard, I'm less focused on the historical results of that becoming. That is, the finished man, the human, that might be achieved at the end of the civilizing process, and more concerned in this moment with the fabrication of a new becoming. The fabrication of a new becoming executed among people throughout the colonies of the metropole. We might summarize that fabricated becoming in three modalities of assimilation that should be in some way familiar to many of us. First, there is nationalist assimilation that made the place-based identities of so many peoples inconsequential in terms of who they must become. They must become identifiable and intelligible within nationalist frames and through the operations of a global market linked to those nationalist frames. Their identities rooted in land and animal, race and story, history and ritual may be important to them locally, but those identities do not speak of future that should matter to anyone else on their immediate ethnic circle. Nationalist assimilation forces peoples into becoming of citizens and into what sociologists Karen and Barbara Fields call racecraft, play on witchcraft, racecraft, the spiritual alchemy that allows racial reasoning to function in the ways peoples conceive and articulate national identity, even if race is understood by them as a fiction. So there's first nationalist assimilation. Then secondly, there is aesthetic assimilation that presses all peoples to evaluate themselves according to a white aesthetic. Vision of the true, the good, the beautiful, the noble, the insightful, and the fully human formed by the white European colonial settler. Aesthetic assimilation always enfolds educational practice, fostering a pedagogy of how to value and how to evaluate down to the bone and dirt. That evaluation formed inside temporal frameworks that presented settler time as the only real time, and thusly settlers' visions of past, present, and future were mapped onto indigenous life. Aesthetic assimilation through the evaluative regimes established processes of approximation, racial approximation, whereby so many people were and are pulled into relentless performances of whiteness. Thirdly, there is commodity assimilation that presses all peoples to make themselves over, that is, to make themselves sellable, to look at their own culture and ways of life through an abiding utility. This commodity assimilation forms a process of becoming that invites people to disassociate from their own cultures, almost to the point of alienation, as they look to map structures of commercial value onto their ways of life, and then to look to translate that value into marketability. These modalities of assimilation are often woven together and show themselves most powerfully at the site of immigrant life, where people are forced to what I call, what I will elaborate in the next lecture, what I call a dismal contemplation. A dismal contemplation of their identities at the places of constant alienation. I think of the powerful and poignant poem by the Somali-born British poet Hulsean Shire, S-H-I-R-E, from her fabulous poem entitled Assimilation, which I will read to you now. Hulsean Shire, Assimilation. We never unpacked, dreaming in the wrong language, carrying our mother's fears in our feet. If he raises his voice, we will flee. If he looks bored, we will pack our bag. Unable to excise the refugee from our hearts, unable to sleep through the night. The refugee's heart has 6 chambers. The first is your mother's unpacked suitcase. And the second, your father cries into his hands. The third room is the immigration office. Your severed legs in the fourth. In the fifth, the uterus. Yours? Question mark. The sixth opens to the white paper. I can't get the refugee out of my body. I bolt my body whenever I get the chance. How many pills does it take to fall asleep? How many to meet the dead? The refugee's heart often grows an outer layer, an assimilation. It cocoons the organ. Those unable to grow the extra skin die within the first 6 months in a host country. At each and every checkpoint, the refugee is asked, "Are you human?" The refugee is sure it's still human, but worries that overnight, while it slept, there may have been a change in classification. We know that so many people have and continue to push back against the modalities of assimilation. Yet the modes of resistance and renunciation to those modalities of assimilation carry profound burdens of entanglement. Too many people have found themselves proposing various cultural nationalisms or the violent practices of nation states to combat national assimilation. Others remain trapped in racial and class hierarchies, even as they resist aesthetic assimilation. And commodity assimilation presents us with the inescapable problem of ownership inside the possessive logics that we will explore in our next two lectures. Renunciation and resistance are yet crucial responses to the history of Christian colonial assimilation and its ongoing effects rooted deeply in the operations of nation states and corporations. Yet what if renunciation and resistance are in fact life practices that require a home and strategies of expansion that would draw more people into their work? And what if, dear friend, such a drawing was at the heart of the Christian life? There at the heart of the Christian life is Worcestershire's refugee, no longer growing an outer layer, but witnessing those yielding to the Spirit and engaged in life practices that form an extra skin, shared with those born in different dirt, shared with those who find themselves alienated and in alien space. As life practice, then, I suggest a different kind of assimilation that draws on the central energy at the heart of creaturely existence and at the heart of an actual doctrine of creation. The energy of creaturely becoming. The energy that draws us into the lives of other people to create the new. What if there were a different way to frame a practice of assimilation, away from this colonial matrix and an asymmetrical horizon, one people assimilating another? I'm imagining it beyond violence, beyond conquest, beyond loss or erasure. That is, I'm imagining it beyond producing social death and death-bound subjects. I'm also imagining it beyond forms of forced imitation, rooted in the colonialist desire to possess, control, and master the minds, bodies, and behaviors, along with the land and labor of their former colonial subjects. What if assimilation might be reconceived from the sight of people relating to land, animals, plants, waters, bodies of water, seasons, as they relate to it? As I close, there is an immediate objection that I want to just say before you even ask me. The immediate objection to what I am saying here is that, Dr. Jennings, this all comes too late, much too late. After centuries of forced assimilation, after the transformation of land into private property and national territory, and bodies into race and nationalist beings, which I'm going to talk about in the next lectures, what I am saying, it could be argued, comes long after Christian doctrines of creation have hardened like concrete in the sun and are a fixed pedagogical substance. These objections would be the final word, if not for the fact, friends, if not for the fact that creatures are contingent and mutable, and therefore not only can change, but do change. The question now is about the powers that look to control the energy of creaturely becoming and therefore guide change. Practices of assimilation are always about the direction or misdirection of that energy. To conceive assimilation within a new pedagogy of creaturely becoming, then, turns us toward forming new configurations of shared perceiving. And what if such shared perceiving were the actual conditions of possibility for the articulation of a doctrine of creation and for building shared modes of contemplating our life with God as creatures? This is the theologically unthought. This is the theologically unthought that is missing in a Christian doctrine of creation. And in my next lecture, we will consider the effect of that absence on how we read Scripture and understand the God-world relation. Thank you very much.